Well, hi, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Kate Jacobson, and I want to welcome you all here to Ramsey County Library. I'm a librarian with the system, and tonight I have the honor of getting to introduce your speaker, William Swanson. Now, Bill has been in journalism for 50 or so years, he's told me, and
approaching 50.
Approaching 50. He, of course, started, as he said, when he was 4. But he's still in journalism, and as part of an extension of that, he became an author of books. And this is his 3rd book that he's going to talk about tonight, Stolen from the Garden, The Kidnapping of Virginia Piper. And it's a fascinating story, and I'm going to let him get to it in just a moment. But I wanted to remind you that tonight's program has been brought to you through legacy funding, which is something that all of you as voters got to help bring to us, because your vote helped, fund tons of programs, and this is just one of them. Okay, William Swanson.
Thank you. Thank you, Kay. Can you all hear me all right? Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I've gotten used to, in the last several months, thanking everybody for coming out in this abysmal weather, but I can't do that tonight. Now I got to thank you for spending your beautiful evening with me, which I'm not sure I would have done, but I'm pleased that you're here, and I hope this will be a worthwhile evening. I'm guessing, just looking around the room here, that most of you were probably alive in 1972. Just a guess, in 1972, July 27th, 1972, when Virginia Piper was kidnapped and this incredible story began. Nobody's arguing with that, are they?
I was 4.
You were 4, yeah. Just starting your journalism career, I bet, yes. I'm wondering how many of you lived around here and were aware, as a newspaper reader, television watcher, whatever, of this case. Okay, the vast majority. I assume that some of you have read the book. I know at least one gentleman has, because he told me. But I'm also gonna just because there's a lot going on, and we have a lot of crimes and mysteries to keep track of in our day and age, I'm just going to briefly review the story of Virginia Piper. Then I'm going to read a little bit from the book, and then I'm going to turn the show over to you and try to answer the questions or respond to the comments that you might have. That's always the best part of these programs. I'm interested in what you're interested in rather than what I think you might be interested in. So anyway, July 27th, 1972, an ordinary summer day in the Twin Cities, except about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 masked men waving guns walked in the front door of the Orono home of Harry and Virginia Piper. Harry Piper was the chairman and CEO of Piper, Jaffray, and Hopwood, the Minneapolis-based regional stock brokerage. Ginny Piper, his 49-year-old wife, what was then known widely as a socialite, meaning in those days the wife of a wealthy man and a person who's active in all kinds of community, civic, and philanthropic activities. The 2 guys with the guns were obviously looking for Bobby. Bobby was what everyone called Harry. This gets a little bit confusing. Harry Piper Jr. is the man in question here, widely known to friends and colleagues as Bobby, and that's what we'll call him tonight. These 2 kidnappers were looking for Bobby. Bobby wasn't home. Ginny Piper was out in the backyard tending to her flowers before she was going to set off for a board meeting at Northwestern Hospital. in South Minneapolis. This was before it was Abbott Northwestern. Yes. They walked in, they asked for the old man. She said, he's not here. They asked about a safe. She said, we don't have one, which was true. And so they slapped handcuffs on her, put a pillowcase over her head, and put her in the back seat of a waiting car, and off they went. Before they left, however, they left an envelope with a ransom note in it, demanding $1 million for the prisoner's release. This set about one of probably the largest FBI manhunt, certainly to that time. Police and FBI were scouring the entire area. Unbeknownst to them or anybody else, Ginny Piper in the back seat of her abductor's car was speeding toward Duluth and ended up a couple hours later handcuffed still, occasionally chained to a tree, but standing in the rain with her captor, with one of her captors in Jay Cook State Park. I think we all know where Jay Cook State Park is, just south of Duluth, off 35. Bobby Piper, meantime, called the FBI, of course, and called his friend George Dixon, who was president of First National Bank of Minneapolis. This is another aspect of this time, of these times. All of these people knew each other. The old boy network was in full swing. So it's hard for most of us, I imagine, to realize that you could just pick up your phone and say, hey, George, I need $1 million in cash, unmarked bills. And George said, okay, I'll put it together. Bobby Piper got a satchel containing $1 million to deliver on Friday night. Ginny Piper was kidnapped on Thursday afternoon. Bobby Piper got instructions for the delivery of this money on Friday evening, and he set out immediately on a very harrowing ride, not knowing where he was going, simply following a series of posted instructions that he would find along the way as kind of almost like a reverse scavenger hunt. He ended up in the parking lot of a bar near downtown Minneapolis. It's now under I-94. And that's where the money was apparently and likely removed from the trunk of the car he was driving by the kidnappers while he was inside the bar following their instructions and making some bogus phone calls. Meanwhile, Ginny Piper is standing in the rain and the cold, hungry, terrified, needless to say, in Jay Cook State Park. She has one captor who she's instructed not to look at. The blindfold is gone by this time. And so she's standing there Thursday night, Friday night, not knowing what her fate is going to be. Saturday morning, as everybody is out looking for Ginny Piper by this time, the money has been delivered, but Saturday morning, a clergyman in Minneapolis gets a call, an anonymous caller who has instructions that he's supposed to pass on to the FBI as to the location of Ginny Piper. He, of course, passes that information on to the FBI, and 3 hours later, the FBI is in Jay Cook State Park, and there's Ginny Piper. Filthy, soaking wet, hungry, dying for a cigarette, chained to this tree. Physically unharmed, other than the bruises that the handcuffs caused on her wrists. But remarkably, she had not been sexually molested, she had not been pushed around, she had not really even been threatened. But of course, she was traumatized and would suffer from that trauma the rest of her life. For the next 5 years, the FBI looked for these guys and looked for the money. They had a 5-year window in which to operate. There's a 5-year federal statute of limitations on kidnapping. And so they had until July of 1977 to solve this crime. As it happened, 16 days before the statute expired in July of 1977, they arrested 2 men. These were 2 of literally 1,000+ suspects, or persons of interest, we would probably call them today, that the FBI had looked at in this incredible dragnet over the previous 5 years. Ken Callahan and Donald Larsen were 2 middle-aged career criminals, not big-time criminals. These were guys who had been in and out of prison since they were in their teens for everything from stolen cars to possessing counterfeit money-making equipment to armed robbery. They had never been involved in a kidnapping as far as anybody knew, but they were arrested on the basis of some small pieces of forensic information that we can talk about later. In the fall of 1977, they were tried in federal district court in St. Paul. Thor Anderson, an assistant U.S. attorney, prosecuted them, and Ron Meschbecher and Bruce Hartigan, 2 of the most prominent defense attorneys in the Twin Cities at the time, defended Callahan and Larsen respectively. After a long, complicated trial during the fall of 1977, a jury deliberated for 4 days and then came back with guilty verdicts on the 2 men. Those verdicts were immediately appealed, of course, and eventually overturned by a federal appellate court. They were tried again a year later, fall of 1978, and this time after a different jury deliberated for all of 4 hours, the jury found them not guilty. And so, case closed. The FBI insisted, and will no doubt tell you to this day, that second jury simply got it wrong, that Larsen and Callahan were in fact Virginia Piper's kidnappers. Virginia Piper and Bobby Piper, for that matter, thought that Larsen and Callahan were the kidnappers. But there's a lot of reason to think that they were not, and that the FBI was desperate to make an arrest and to get a couple of indictments before the statute of limitations expired. The net result, of course, though, is that nobody has spent a day in prison for the kidnapping of Virginia Piper. Of even greater interest, at least to some people, except for about $4,000 in random $20 Piper bills, as they were called. That $1 million has never been recovered. It has been called the most successful kidnapping in American history, and it's pretty hard to argue against that. Virginia and Bobby Piper both died Virginia Piper in 1988 and Bobby in 1990, both of cancer. They had 3 sons, Harry III, Addison, better known as Tad, who succeeded his father in running Piper Jaffray, and the 3rd, David, who's now a state district court judge in Minneapolis. Harry Piper III, who was a lawyer, tried very hard to write a book about his parents and about this case. He wanted to solve it, and he wanted to he wanted to make sure the world knew how courageous his parents had been. And they had been pretty courageous. I don't think there's any debate about that. But Harry, for all his work and for all the money he spent suing the federal government for FBI documents, was not able to put a book together. And I came into the picture in December of 2011 when I called Harry. He was then living in Oregon, knowing that the 40th anniversary of the Piper kidnapping was approaching, and thought I'd make a good magazine article. I've spent much of my career writing magazine articles. And so I thought, here's the son trying to celebrate his parents' character and maybe also solve this enormous crime. Harry was just about ready to give up at that point and said, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a writer, I've got thousands of documents in my basement and I'm just not able to put it together. Plus I'm dispirited because I'm no closer to solving this crime than when I started 10 years ago. He read my first book, which is about the Carroll Thompson case in 1963 called Dial M, The Murder of Carroll Thompson. And he was impressed with it. He was impressed with the respect and the attention that I gave to the Thompson family, both before and after the murder. And he said, would you like to write about my family? I said, well, I might. Please understand, though, that you cannot, this would be my book. It's not something that I would write on your behalf or with your approval or anything like that. And he says, well, I understand that. And he said, I'm willing to turn over all my documents and my interviews to you. The only string attached is that when you're done, turn the materials over to the Minnesota Historical Society, who also happens to be my publisher. And do the best job you can. Try to write an accurate and comprehensive account of this crime and its aftermath. So that's what I've tried to do. His brothers eventually, reluctant at first, eventually bought into that, and the three of them were extremely cooperative to me throughout this process, and this book would not have been written without their very candid recollections and insights. And again, they did not see any of this before it was published. I do fact check religiously with everybody I interview, and so I fact checked with them, but they read nothing. So it is truly an independent book, and I'm pleased to say that they were happy the way it turned out. I'm going to do something a little bit different, at least for me. I am going to concentrate on the money tonight. Maybe it's because tax time is coming. It just seems like it's a very interesting part of this story, obviously, and it's one I really haven't read from before. So we'll see how this goes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is already an obvious, and depending on whom you ask, either a reassuring or an unsettling presence at both houses. There are two houses where the family gathers the day of the kidnapping. There's the Piper home on Spring Hill Road, and then there's the home of Virginia Piper's sister, Charlotte, down closer to Lake Minnetonka. Large, mostly middle-aged men in dark suits, white shirts, conservative ties, and wingtip shoes. They are agents from the Bureau's Minneapolis office. Kidnapping is not a federal offense unless the kidnappers take their victim across the state line. But over the years, the Bureau has assumed the role of national kidnapping authority, believing, based on experience, that fleeing kidnappers will, more often than not, engage in interstate transit. For obvious reasons, a quick reaction is essential. So at least in the case of kidnappings, especially when the victim is prominent and there is a substantial ransom demand, the FBI tends to presume jurisdiction from the first call to the local office. In this case, if Ginny isn't a prominent person beyond her social and philanthropic circle, her husband is, at least moderately so, and certainly within the investment banking industry. Beyond dispute is the substantiality of the ransom demand, which in fact will soon be described, if it isn't immediately, as the largest ransom demand in Bureau annals, $1 million. The amount is specified, excuse me. The amount is specified in the first sentence of the ransom note, which was typed, single-spaced, all caps, on a single sheet of common notebook paper, folded in thirds and tucked into the white envelope, addressed to family. Rushing in the door at approximately 1:45 this afternoon, Bobby snatches the envelope off the desk in the living room where the kidnappers left it and reads the following. Now I'm going to read this ransom note in full. I'm assuming none of you have received a ransom note in your experience. So this one I'm going to read and understand that there's a few misspellings and some grammatical lapses and punctuation problems, but I'll just read it through. The ransom is $1 million. Entire amount will be in used, unmarked $20 bills. The money will be prepared in 4 separately wrapped packages of $250,000 each. The 4 packages will be delivered in one large canvas or duck bag, brown or olive in color, with drawstring top. No electronic tracking or signal devices will be in this bag or the packages of money. Before the prisoner is safely returned to you, the money will be examined for obvious markings. Tests will be made for unusually high measures of radioactivity, and the money will be subjected to examination with infrared and ultraviolet light. If these or other detectable methods of marking are found on any portion of the money, it will not be considered acceptable. The money will be delivered tomorrow evening. The amount of money is established and will not be negotiated. The time of delivery has been established and will not be extended for any reason. The person making the delivery must be closely associated with the company of Piper, Jaffray, and Hopwood. Before delivery is accepted, this person will be examined for authenticity. Only the most intimate knowledge of PJ&H business will enable him to satisfy this examination. The person making the delivery will use an automobile registered to his home address. The money will be carried in the trunk of the car. The automobile fuel tank must be previously filled before leaving. The person making the delivery will carry a minimum of $200 on his person. He will carry an assortment of change in his pocket, including at least 5 dimes. He will be prepared to leave from the prisoner's home to make the delivery as soon as instructions are received at approximately 9:30 p.m. When instructions are received at this time, departure will be immediate. Law enforcement radio frequencies will be monitored while the delivery is in progress, and any unusual activity will be noted. If this occurs, the delivery will not be accepted. If the delivery is not accomplished as planned, no further contact will be made. If all instructions are carefully followed, the safety of the person making the delivery is assured. When the money has been received in accordance to instruction, the prisoner will be safely released. The release will occur at 6 a.m. Suffice it to say, Bobby Piper has never handled a document like this. There is no loony rant or semi-literate scrawl or mismatched type cut out of a magazine and pasted on a sheet of paper the way it's done in the movies. There is no crude or taunting language, not even an overt threat, though the word prisoner used twice, and the promise of no further contact if the delivery is not accomplished have to make Bobby's blood run cold. The specificity of the instructions and sophistication of the language, misspellings and quirky punctuation aside, suggests there will be no wiggle room in any aspect of the ransom preparation and delivery. The density of the 400-word stacked chock-a-block on the single sheet of paper evokes the immovability of a brick wall. What can be inferred about the abduction itself is limited but important. This is clearly not a case of a couple of punks randomly selecting a baronial estate in a fancy neighborhood and snatching whatever millionaire is unfortunate enough to answer the door. The kidnappers know these are the Pipers of PJ and H. Their reference to the prisoner, and not to either Bobby or Ginny or any other family member, would seem to mean, however, that they were prepared to take whichever Piper was available. This idea is qualified, though, when the investigators learn from Bernice and Vernetta, Ginny's two housekeepers who were on the premises when she was kidnapped, that the intruders asked Ginny about her old man and were upset when told that he wasn't home. Bobby evidently was their first choice. Does the stipulation of 4 separately wrapped packages mean there are 4 kidnappers? What about the 5 dimes? Apparently, the person delivering the money will have to make calls from a payphone. This is 1972, remember? Does the minimum $200 also required of the courier hint at a journey involving the purchase of a bus, train, or airplane ticket? Aside from the note, its envelope, and the strips of plastic tape used to bind the cleaning women, there is nothing. No blood, no weapon, no muddy footprints for the agents to look at. A forensics crew will dust the premises for fingerprints, but they can't expect to find much if the cleaning women are correct about the men wearing gloves. On the orders of the First National Bank's George Dixon, Milton Snyder, the bank's vice president for audit and security, and a dozen bank employees prepared Ginny Piper's ransom. They are careful not to diverge from the precise instructions the kidnappers left on Thursday. But it's a big job that also follows a protocol developed by the FBI for use in airline hijackings and other emergencies involving large amounts of extorted cash. Now remember, this is a time, late 60s, early 70s, when airline hijackings were almost weekly events. And more often than not, somebody wanted to fly to Havana or Algeria or some other enemy state, as they were called in those days. But they also wanted a sack of money to go with it. Got to spend a little money in Havana if you're there. The bulk of the money, 50,000 used $20 Federal Reserve notes, has been sent over from the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank in an armored car. At First National, Snyder and his crew count the money and bundle it in packs of 100. The bills are not marked or otherwise treated. The serial number of each, however, has been recorded on microfilm, the best technology of the day. The FBI then published a 125-page book with the serial numbers of each of the 50,000 $20 bills. And those books were distributed to banks and other financial institutions and retailers and racetracks around the country. That'll be important later on. Snyder's crew divides the bills into 4 packages containing 125 packs of 2,000 apiece. They wrap each of the 4 packages in a combination of corrugated fiber and plain brown paper and seal them with heavy tape. They place the 4 wrapped packages in a brown canvas bag with a stout drawstring that has been manufactured for the occasion by the Bemis Bag Company, another well-established Minneapolis business, and personally delivered by Bemis President Richard Young, yet another friend of Bobby Piper's. Stretched taut with 4 dense packages, The bag measures 17 by 17 by 36 inches and is roughly the size and shape of a soldier's duffel bag. Filled with 50,000 $20 bills, the bag weighs, according to the bank's scale, 110.5 pounds. At 4:30, witnessed by Special Agent Louis Van Hagen and supervised by Assistant Special Agent in Charge Robert Kent, Special Agents Michael Misko and Robert Marvin place the heavy bag in the trunk of an unmarked Bureau sedan and drive westward out of downtown through the rush hour traffic toward Orono. And then, of course, Bobby, that night about 9:30, Bobby got a call that comprised Ginny's recorded voice. The kidnappers had her record instructions for Bobby's first stop with the money. And that phone call was what Bobby received on 9:30 on Friday night. And then he set out and delivered the money to the back of that bar, as I mentioned. So fast forward exactly 4 months, almost exactly 4 months. On November 28th, Susan Lang, a teller at the Owatonna State Bank about an hour south of the Twin Cities, has just returned from lunch when a husky gentleman wearing a hat and coat asks her to exchange $300 in $20 bills. "5s and 10s, please," he says. She changes the bills, the man exits the bank, and Lang clips the 20s together and tucks them into her cash drawer. 10 minutes later, Lang will recall, the bank receives a phone call saying that Piper money, that's what it was called, Piper money has turned up in Owatonna, and that everybody should keep their eyes open for a man exchanging $20 bills. Lang calls over one of the bank's executives and they compare the serial numbers of the recent customers' 20s with the serial numbers in the little book they received from the FBI in August. The serial numbers of the man's 15 bills match 15 serial numbers in the book. A short time later, Lang describes the man to an FBI agent as a white male, 50 to 55 years old, between 5'10" and 6 feet tall, weighing about 200 pounds, with a ruddy, pockmarked face. She remembers the hat, but can't recall if the man was wearing glasses. A coworker says he was. The quick transaction in Owatonna, one of several exchanges of Piper money in late November 1972, goes down as among the first documented appearances of the $1 million ransom. An individual believed to be the same man Lang served in Owatonna has exchanged about $1,600 worth of $20 bills at 3 other banks on the same day. Accumulating reports indicate additional 20s have been turned in for other denominations at banks in Rochester, Austin, and 3 other communities, totaling close to $4,000. Witness descriptions of the man exchanging the bills are similar enough, a solidly built, square-jawed, middle-aged white man wearing a hat, etc., to allow an FBI artist to rough out a sketch, but too general to give the sketch much practical value. The occasional description containing meaningful specifics: a blue fur hat with a gold band, glasses with thick round lenses and gold wire rims, a square black or onyx-like ring on the right pinky finger, a blood clot under the nail of his left thumb, is not corroborated by other witnesses. A report out of Rochester cites a husky middle-aged man in the company of a short woman, the only female of any stature mentioned at this time. Despite the confusion, Richard Held in the FBI's Minneapolis office believes this is a major break and floods southern Minnesota with agents. A local sheriff tells a reporter that law enforcement is only hours behind the kidnappers. In the Twin Cities, a bank association official reportedly shares the news with a Minneapolis cop who in turn confides in a journalist friend. Aware that the news is on the street, Held begs the media to sit on the story for a few days, in which time his agents will catch up with their man or men. The media comply until on November 30th, the Minneapolis Star runs the story on its front page, infuriating Held, but in editor Robert King's words, only confirming what a lot of people already knew and countless others had heard in the form of rumor and speculation. The husky man with a hat and possibly a blood clot under a thumbnail vanishes, visible only in the FBI's everyman sketch that the papers include with their follow-up stories. Now that money, a few more 20s would show up over the next few months in wildly diverse places. There's some retail operations in Brooklyn Park where some of those 20s showed up. At least one 20 showed up in a drug deal, a drug bust in Philadelphia. It's clear, it seems clear to me anyway, that whoever was smart enough to get away with this money was also smart enough to find a way to launder it. And I doubt very much if that duffel bag is under a Rice County cornfield to this day. But so let me hear what you all might want to talk about or ask about or whatever. Questions, comments? Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, did you all hear the question?
Yeah.
Okay. The FBI over the next 5 years looked at everybody. They looked at everybody who worked at Piper Jaffray, everybody who once worked at Piper Jaffray, anybody who worked in the Baker Building, which is where Piper Jaffray was located in Minneapolis at the time. They looked at anybody who ever did any work for the Pipers or in the Piper neighborhood. You know, they would have parties and they would hire a bartender and they'd hire, you know, waitresses, and so all of those people were interrogated, and often many times. I have all these documents or copies of these documents, and it's absolutely astonishing. All the people. I mean, if any of you been talked to by the FBI in this case, you have.
Yes, I have.
See, this was clearly the way they operated. They talked to everybody. FBI, and this was a bad time for the FBI, as you may recall. About 8 months before the Piper kidnapping, there was the D.B. Cooper hijacking or skyjacking of a Northwest Airlines flight. He jumped out over the state of Washington with a briefcase with $250,000 in it. He's never been found. Some of the money has been found down in the forest under, you know, beneath the flight path. But you know, the FBI, that was such a high-profile case, as was this. The FBI was under a lot of pressure. Plus, there was everything going on. The Black Panthers were operating, the anti-war people, the kids were taking over college campuses, and the FBI themselves, one of their offices in Pennsylvania was burglarized one night by some anti-war activists who made off with tons of their own top secret documents. I mean, this was just, and J. Edgar Hoover had just died a couple months before the Piper kidnapping, and then of course you've heard of Watergate. Watergate was in June of the break-in was in June of 1972. So the FBI was really under a lot of pressure, and this was a very embarrassing case for them. Not at first, of course, but as it wound out. And they were looking at all these people, $1 million that hadn't been, you know, that was unprecedented. So they were looking at everybody. So, yes, sir. Mr. Piper insisted it be done that way. The FBI did not want him to do that. But to me, that's an important part of the book because it says a lot about him. He believed that only he should bear the responsibility of delivering this money, not knowing, as I say, where he was going, who was waiting for him, whether his wife was still alive, wherever she might be, not knowing any of that, having $1 million in the trunk of his car and not even knowing where he was headed. But he insisted they do it that way. He did have a beeper in the back seat of his car, and he had a camera installed by the FBI did all this behind the grill of his Oldsmobile. But that was all that would supposedly connect him as far as he knew. Unbeknownst to him, the FBI decided to flood the area with some 35 cars. They didn't know where he was going either, of course. But they put these cars out in the whole western metro area, kind of positioned, thinking that they would spot him and pick up the case. Well, it turned out that the kidnappers were ahead of the FBI in their thinking. What you said earlier, ma'am, that these were not learned men. You can tell by the spelling and the word choice and all of that. But they were very intelligent men, very, very canny men. I'm assuming they were men. We don't know, but I'm assuming that. So he's not taking any chances. He's going to follow these instructions to the letter, no matter what happens. And one of the FBI agents put his arm around David as Bobby was getting in his car and told him, "You better be prepared not to see your parents again." Now there's a comforting thought to tell a 19-year-old kid, but so yes. Don Larsen, and this is yet another really bizarre twist to this case. In 1976, 4 years after the kidnapping, Don Larsen murdered 5 people, including his estranged wife, her lover, and 3 kids that the Larsens had in various combinations with other people. So Don Larsen was already serving a life sentence. Ken Callahan was not. And for some reason, and I've talked to Thor Anderson about this, Thor Anderson did not ask the judge to lock Ken Callahan up during appeal, which he could have requested. And of course, the thinking is they wanted Ken Callahan to go and lead the FBI to the money. Ken Callahan knew where the money was, right? So that we don't know if that's true, but that was the supposition. But no, I guess Ken Callahan maybe spent 3 days in jail, not prison, but in Ramsey County Jail, waiting for the trial to start. But that's it. Yes, sir. Again.
I understand your logistics behind that. Hopefully that he can.
At the first trial, they were convicted.
Right.
But there is a time during appeal where the convicted person, before sentencing, can be, again, at the discretion of the judge.
Okay.
And that was the case. Ken Callahan was not a violent man. I don't think anybody was afraid that he was going to go out and kidnap anybody. And it's entirely possible that they were thinking that, yeah, maybe if we let him go and keep our eyes on him, he's gonna lead us to the money. And incidentally, the FBI did dig up the farm near Willow River where Don Larsen lived for a while and murdered these 5 people, but found nothing. Yes, ma'am. I would say that if you knew the Pipers in any capacity, or their kids for that matter, they were questioning one of the daughters-in-law about men she had dated at McGill University in Canada years earlier. Yeah. Case is Ginny Piper was convinced that the guy guarding her in the state park, she got one brief. He's told her her blindfold fell off, and he said, "Now don't look at me. I'm going to be sitting or standing behind you. Don't look at me." so she tried not to look at him. She did see when he eventually offered her some food and an occasional cigarette, and she could see his hands when he would light a match for her cigarette, and she could see that he was a white man. But that's about all she could see. But then on one occasion, she just, perhaps too tired to realize what she was doing, she turned her head, and she just got a glimpse of this man, kind of off her shoulder. And the man had a woman's nylon stocking over his head, but there was a run on the left side, down the left side of the head. So in that split second, she saw that, he had kind of bushy sideburns, again, 1972. He was either a white man or an American Indian. He was not a black. And she insists, a white mark alongside the pupil of his eye. And that mark, that condition is later identified as Arcus Senilis. Arcus Senilis is a condition of the eye. It doesn't affect the vision or anything. It usually sets in middle age, often among heavier people. And once you have it, it doesn't go away. You always have it. So needless to say, at trial, Meshbesher and Hartigan paraded their clients in front of the jury. And of course, neither man had any markings on his eyes. And that didn't necessarily make any difference to that first jury, but that was an interesting part of the case. They had an ophthalmologist from the University of Minnesota testify. They had her studying ophthalmology textbooks, and she was absolutely, she went to her grave insisting that these were the guys, and that one of them had this Arcus Senilis. Yes. For how many brilliant planners these guys were, they made some really bonehead mistakes in the commission of this crime. I say at the end, like all very successful people, they're lucky, whatever else they are. These guys were just stone cold lucky to get away given the mistakes that they made. I think that's unlikely. I don't think these guys were professional people. I think they were amateurs. They were amateur kidnappers, but I don't think these were professional people. I don't think these were college-educated people. I think that the information that Ginny picked up from this guy who was guarding her, much of it was made up and designed to mislead. He talked about going back to work on Monday. He's going to go to the Union Hall on Monday. Here's a guy who just got $1 million. Are you going to go to the Union Hall and get your asbestos job back? I don't know. Stuff like that is really questionable, I think.
What would that
Arthur Stillman was an older man, a businessman in the Twin Cities. He was also, for a time, a member of the Minnesota State Parole Board. In those days, we had parole boards deciding the fate of people like T. Eugene Thompson after a certain number of years. Stillman ran a very successful business, apparently, flower shops around the country. Flower City, if memory serves, is the name of it. He was also an employer of Donald Larsen. But he employed a lot of ex-cons that he had gotten to know through his work on the parole board, and Donald Larsen was one of them. Donald Larsen considered him, kind of a Dutch uncle, just a very kindly person. He lent him money and so forth. Arthur Stillman died before the first trial. He was an older man, and it's been suggested he was a suspect for a while. Oh, sure, until fairly late in the game, actually. it was suggested that it would have to be somebody like Arthur Stillman, who had the intelligence to put together a plan like this. But there was, you know, he did appear before a grand jury before he died, and his testimony before the grand jury was read at one of the trials. But there was never anything that would really link him to the crime other than his relationship with Don Larsen. One of the questions that arose, of course, is why Ginny Piper? Gee, there are a lot richer people than the Pipers out there. You know, why? You know, these are nothing compared to the Pillsburys and the Daytons and so forth. The money was repaid. Funny little anecdote. As George Dixon is turning this $1 million over to his pal Bobby, it occurs to him that, you know, maybe we should get something down in writing here. And of course, Bobby agrees. This is, you know, these gentlemen, they know each other, but they are businessmen after all. So according to one story, Bobby picks up a yellow legal pad and writes something to the effect, I, Harry Piper Jr., owe the First National Bank $1 million. Signed, Harry Piper Jr., and hands it to George Dixon. The money was paid back out of his earnings at the firm and family money that he negotiated with his mother, he said. He explained how he paid it back in one of the trials, when he testified at one of the trials. Sure, because hard to believe, but the car that Bobby ended up driving with that $1 million, driving to the Sportsman's Retreat, which was the name of that bar, was the car that Ginny Piper had been kidnapped in. This is one of those amateurish mistakes that has everybody scratching their head. They kidnapped her in a 1971 Monte Carlo, drove her up to Jay Cook, and then one of them, or more, I believe there were more than 2 guys involved, drove back to Minneapolis in the same car with every law enforcement officer in this 5-state area looking for this car. They didn't have an exact description of it. The cleaning ladies got a look at it, but they really didn't know their cars, and you know, they were kind of sketchy in their description. But anyway, the kidnappers wouldn't know that. The kidnappers wouldn't know who saw them leaving the Piper house. So, but nonetheless, they drive back in that car. And on the first stop, as I say, it's kind of this reverse scavenger hunt that Bobby's on. He drives away from his home with his $1 million in the trunk of his white Oldsmobile, his family car. And actually it's the second stop, he is told to pull into a Bridgman's, remember Bridgman's ice cream? A Bridgman's parking lot. This is about, you know, 10:30 at night, it's dark. And look for a car with 2 strips of tape in the back window, vertical strips of tape in the back window, which he does, he sees. And his, you know, the instructions say you take the $1 million from your car, put it in the trunk of this car. The keys are in the car, and then follow the further instructions, which eventually takes him to the Sportsman's.
Ironic thing, this was one of his cars.
What's that?
This was one of his cars originally.
No, it wasn't his. It was the kidnapper's car. They had stolen it a couple of weeks before. Yeah, I mean, he didn't know whose car it was. He didn't know that Ginny had been taken away in that car. But it's just one of those incredibly screwy aspects of this case. So he's delivering the money in the car that his wife was kidnapped in the day before. And he ends up, according to these instructions, I mean, he's following these, you know, turn right, turn. He ends up in this parking lot. He goes inside, and he's got a phone call to make. And you know, you wait and wait, and he's got to wait for a payphone to be available. And and then he's instructed to go into the men's room and put the key above the men's room's door. When he's, because he's done with that car now, for now. The trunk key. While he's in there, obviously, somebody removes the sack of money from the trunk. Because when he goes out, further instructions, he's told to drive to the Holiday store in Bloomington on 80th and Lyndale and leave it there. And that's from there he goes home. And the FBI watched the car, thinking at the very least they're going to find Ginny Piper's body in the trunk. The next morning they tow it away and they open up the trunk and they find nothing. I mean, it's just, you can't make this up, folks.
Well, they were pretty smart doing it.
I believe it was 3 or 4 amateur men, possibly Canadian or British, given the language and the spelling in these communications. I believe that they were amateurs in the sense that they didn't have any criminal history, at least not in this country, because if you had any sort of federal rap, the FBI would have come looking for you, talking to you too. The FBI talked to both Larsen and Callahan, among hundreds of others, within a week of the kidnapping. So I think, as I was telling Mark my friend Mark before the presentation, they were probably middle-aged men at the time, and are quite possibly not with us anymore. I certainly believe the money isn't with us, and probably wasn't from a very early point in the story.
You asked that.
No, there was never, and they never were able to really lift anything, any fingerprints off the steering wheel or anything else. They did find one fingerprint on a torn little fragment of shopping bag on the floor of the car, and that became the basis for arresting Don Larsen. That fingerprint had been analyzed 3 times by the FBI's crack forensic people in Washington. 3 times it was, they didn't know who it belonged to, including Don Larsen, who, as I say, was part of the mix from the beginning. And then the 4th time they looked at it again with that looming statute of limitations, and decided, hey, I think it's Don Larsen's. And that's what they took to court, and as you might expect, a couple of sharp attorneys like Meshbesher and Hartigan had great fun with that. I mean, I choose these subjects in part based on who's available still, who's still alive to talk about it, what court documents are available, what investigative materials are around, and so it really is very much a mix of all of those things. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you.